In the summer of 1953, CIA agent Kermit Roosevelt Jr. paced his office, or, as he liked to refer to it, his battle station at the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. President Theodore Roosevelt's grandson, Kermit, really enjoyed feeling like he was in command. On the streets of Iran, however, outside the embassy, nobody seemed to be in charge of anything. Crowds of protesters were chanting anti-American slogans as they marched down the street beyond the gates at the edge of the embassy grounds. On the street, something that sounded like a glass bottle exploded. Moving to his window, Kermit closed the blinds. Tehran, the capital, had been in turmoil for the last 3 days, but the Iranian leadership was cordial with the United States at the time. The city had been rocked by riots and protests, and now the violence was intensifying. One by one, statues of former Iranian leaders had been demolished. In addition, the rioters had set fire to both bystanders and counter-protesters, looting every structure in the major city plaza. Tension was high inside the American embassy, and hundreds had already killed in the rioting. In an attempt to maintain composure, CIA Director of Operations, Kermit, inhaled deeply. Then, his radio operator, already on the edge of tears, staggered into his office as the door flung wide. He held up a cable transmission with a trembling hand. There had been a delay of some sort, but it had been sent nearly 24 hours ago. As he read the communication out loud, the operator appeared ill and urged Kermit and his people to leave Tehran, for the rioters could assault the embassy, and it was too late for them to escape Iran alive. Washington wanted them out of there. Kermit, however, was unsurprised. Since the street fighting began, he had been ordered to leave the embassy 3 times. The operator panicked when he heard a gunshot someplace below, but Kermit did not flinch. With a chilly chuckle, he instructed the operator to go back to his desk, because they had no intention of leaving. As if on a death march, the radio operator retreated from his office and strode down the corridor. However, Kermit was not even somewhat alarmed, since he was aware of something his American superiors were not. He was the cause of all this mayhem, and everything was going better than he could have imagined. One area that appears to be in perpetual instability is the Middle East. There are so many countries that are at odds with one another, deliberately antagonistic to the U.S. and its friends in the West. Every American president must devise a diplomatic plan for the Middle East, and some have lost a great deal of support, both domestically and internationally, for failing to do so. However, how did it all begin? Although the United States has a lengthy and vile history of involvement, the current acrimonious dispute with Iran can be linked to one of the most complex coup attempts ever, which was headed by a member of the American royal family. On July 19, 1953, a few weeks prior to the start of that coup, Kermit Roosevelt was smoking a cigarette outside the cement border patrol facility that marked the entrance into Iran at the Iraq-Iran border crossing. As border patrol officers inspected documents and cargo trailers before allowing them entry into the nation, semi-trucks thundered along the highway. Kermit took one last pull on the cigarette, extinguished it, and entered the drab Iranian government building, painted beige. Inside, his driver was already standing at the desk of a border patrol agent. The agent was using a fine-tooth comb to sift through their documents. The agent was already examining Kermit's passport when Kermit arrived at his driver. He quizzed Kermit on his motivations for traveling to Iran and wrote down his responses on a shabby clipboard that had seen better days. The idea that government buildings were always gloomy and depressing, regardless of the nation, made Kermit smile to himself. He saw how the agent obviously misinterpreted the content on the entry documents and wrote over the description box on his passport. The agent wrote Mr. Scar on the right forehead, as if it were his name, and Kermit noticed, smirking. Kermit concluded it was a good omen. It's a sign that he would enter this country as he intended to depart, unaccounted for and unidentifiable. In any case, Kermit had no intention of using his own name. He was on a secret mission here as a CIA agent. He was identified on a phony passport as James Lockridge, the alias he had been using in Iran. Kermit had been given a huge assignment by the CIA to secretly plan the overthrow of the Iranian government and remove Mohammad Mossadegh, who had been appointed as their new prime minister. Kermit was eager to embark on what he perceived as a great adventure. Kermit came from an illustrious family of daring guys. During the Spanish-American War, his grandfather, Theodore Roosevelt, headed a volunteer cavalry squad known as the Rough Riders. It was renowned for his big game hunting adventures. At last, Kermit had the opportunity to achieve greatness, to accomplish the seemingly impossible, and to join his renowned grandfather. Kermit had been reviewing the task throughout the last 3 days. He was only slightly shocked to hear that British intelligence, or MI6, was the one who first suggested the coup. However, after giving it some thinking, he realized that MI6's involvement made a lot of sense. The operation, known as Operation Boot, was a ruse to remove Mossadegh from office and install a prime minister more in line with Western objectives, particularly Western corporate interests. It came out that British spies had already been in Iran for a number of years. The West had benefited from Iranian oil for decades, effectively acquiring stock in the most lucrative oil resources on the planet. Mossadegh, however, was altering that. He has been nationalizing Iranian oil since he took office 2 years ago, retaining the proceeds for Iran, rather than allowing the West to embezzle its resources. This new approach seriously hurt the Western economy and endangered American interests. Thus, the British coup plan was initiated. However, there was a problem. About 9 months ago, in October 1952, Prime Minister Mossadegh discovered the coup and expelled all British ambassadors from Iran. It started a series of events that led to the involvement of the CIA, which is why Kermit Roosevelt was hankering after another smoke in front of a Border Patrol agent's desk. He lighted a cigarette and reached into his pocket for the pack of khaki-branded Marlboros. He observed 2 members of the Border Patrol searching the rear of a livestock truck. He smoked a cigarette and mentally went over his task, going over the information he had laboriously processed. President Dwight Eisenhower himself had ordered this expedition. In the first half of 1953, MI6 had approached Eisenhower and persuaded him that the United States would benefit from a coup in Iran. After a few phone conversations, Kermit ended up in the back seat of a vehicle heading 300 kilometers west of Tehran toward this isolated border crossing. He was attempting to enter Iran specifically to topple its regime. The coup, according to Kermit, his boss, is required to quell Mossadegh's alleged communist tendencies and assure democracy and the benefits of liberty in the Middle East. Kermit knew his opinion was irrelevant, but he did not believe a word of it. He followed instructions from his superiors. The Iranian border agent allowed Kermit to enter the country 10 minutes later, and Kermit and his driver returned to Tehran in their dust-covered vehicle. They spent the afternoon driving through farms, small settlements, and enormous deserts until, at last, as the sun was setting over the desert, the tall skyscrapers and towering minarets of Tehran came into view. Kermit, his great journey was about to start, and he could feel the excitement rushing through him. A few weeks later, Kermit enjoyed the early bustle while strolling down a colorful street in Tehran. Iranians were racing down the sidewalk and clogging the roadway with mopeds as they made their way to work. In contrast, Kermit was taking his usual stroll to the coffee shop down the block, and he was not in a hurry. The ground was covered in bright red pamphlets, which he stepped over. Having seen these pamphlets all morning, he looked down at them. They demanded that Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh be removed from office and denounced him as anti-Islamic. To purchase the English newspaper for that morning, he made a stop at a stand on the next corner. He liked bringing it to the cafe so he could read while sitting there. The headline on the main page said, loud and clear, "Fire Mossadegh." The entire publication looked to be filled with anti-Mossadegh attacks. Kermit was ecstatic to see it, as he had done all of this himself, including the flyers and the newspaper piece. What the CIA was referring to as Operation Ajax was halfway into its initial phase. The mission's primary goal was to take over the Iranian press and infuse all of the country's newspapers with anti-Mossadegh propaganda. Kermit wants only furious journalists and red flyers to be visible to every Iranian eye. In fact, Kermit had been a little nervous about this phase of the operation when he had first arrived in Tehran in mid-July. Without a question, Mossadegh was the most well-liked prime minister in contemporary Iranian history. How can a popular, democratically elected leader incite the opposition of an entire country? He believed it would be impossible to get the Iranian media to publish defamatory articles on Mossadegh. They would oppose his attempts to regulate the information flow. However, he encountered hardly any opposition. It did not cost him much to hire reporters and columnists because the Iranian press was already corrupt. The propaganda had been printed in a never-ending flood after that. He practically had to step over the house in order to leave. Additionally, he had spies in Washington, D.C., publish anti-communist propaganda accusing the prime minister of having Jewish parentage, which was a forbidden subject, along with pretty much whatever other falsehood Kermit could come up with. However, he was unable to determine if the Iranian people were believing these falsehoods. Mossadegh remained incredibly popular. Nevertheless, Operation Ajax was proceeding more smoothly than Kermit had anticipated, so it was time to gradually introduce phase 2 of his strategy: create havoc. Kermit was aware that he would do this as well by compensating Tehrani, expatriates, and Iranians who would be happy to compromise the interests of their own nation. However, these assets needed to have influence. They could not be just anybody. And in a nation where 98% of people were Muslims, that meant going after the mullahs, the scholars, and religious leaders who had significant influence over their followers. Kermit was really currently en route to meet one of these mullahs, but he needed to exercise caution. From the newspaper stand to the coffee shop and then to the park beyond. He spent weeks creating this morning routine so that anyone who might be watching him or making fun of him would have no reason to believe he was doing anything but working out. When Kermit reached the coffee shop, he checked his watch and took a seat at one of the small tables outside. About half an hour before his meeting, he opened the paper and skimmed the page while mentally going over his to-do list. He had to meet with the mullah and buy him off first, then get in touch with some other potential assets. Fortunately, he had access to an active network of Tehrani natives previously maintained by British and CIA intelligence. Kermit would now have access to the few seasoned Iranian agents who were compensated tens of thousands of dollars each month to serve as Western intelligence's eyes and ears. To be honest, Kermit had been taken aback by the high status of some of these resources, including newspaper editors, clerics, military commanders, and politicians. The list continued. The street gang leaders employed by the British and Americans piqued Kermit's curiosity the most. He was aware that he would eventually require them. He was plotting a revolution. After all, Kermit took 3 swigs of his coffee, drained it, and turned the newspaper over. Then he began his usual walk in the park. However, he chose to go down the block and enter a department store across the street. After leaving through a gateway on the far side of the park, rather than doing his usual circuit, he nodded to the makeup salesperson as he passed and made his way to the men's apparel section. He appeared to bystanders to be a mere Western diplomat en route to purchase a silk tie or new shirt, possibly for a forthcoming special event. The mullah was perusing clean white clothes on a nearby rack, and there would be no point in introducing him. Kermit did not even look at the mullah. He simply kept looking around, making his way slowly to the opposite side of the shop. Kermit crossed behind the mullah once, but other than that, there was no interaction between the guys. By the time Kermit left the department shop, 10 minutes later, however, had slipped the holy man an envelope that contained enough cash to persuade the mullah to give a very particular speech that weekend. A few days later, on August 3rd, Kermit got into the back seat of an unmarked automobile. It was intended to convince the mullah's congregation that their new prime minister needed to leave and to condemn Mossadegh as anti-God and irreligious. He frowned as he lay across the seat and threw the wool blanket that was resting on the seat next to him over his body, concealing himself from any spectators. Kermit felt hot as the automobile started to move. He made every effort to control his perspiration because, given his destination, he wanted to appear powerful. As the car slid through trans streets to an impressive set of gates on the city's north side, he, too, did his best to stay still. Although Kermit was unable to see what was going on, he did hear that a security guard had waved the car through after glancing over his driver's license documents. Officially, Kermit had entered the Royal Palace compound a second later. This was the only part of Operation Ajax that had really made Kermit uneasy, and it was the third phase. Kata. He had to get the 32-year-old Shah of Iran, who was effectively the country's king, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, to sign documents removing Mosaddegh as prime minister. You would be requesting the Shah's approval for a coup that would topple his own nation's government, which would be no small feat. Mosaddegh remained Iran's most popular political figure, despite Kermit's campaign of defamation. The young Shah lacked the fortitude to fire Mosaddegh, which would need a great deal of it. It gave the impression of being immature, more focused on being liked and being cool than on leading with any sort of conviction. He might have second thoughts by dawn, even if he accepted the coup. Until he signed the documents and had them brought to Mossadegh's front door, nothing was guaranteed. Kermit still had to persuade him. Kermit did not even want to consider the consequences of failing, not only for Iran in general, or American diplomats in particular. The vehicle came to a halt. Kermit could hear elegant, measured footsteps coming toward the automobile from under his blanket, the click of pricey shoes. The door opened a second later, and Kermit sat up, just enough to let someone take the seat beside him. The vehicle then resumed its sluggish journey to a different area of the royal gardens. Kermit remained silent and waited till the man next to him informed him that everything was okay. Throwing off the blanket, Kermit introduced himself with all the respect he could manage, grinning at the Shah of Iran. The driver had parked away from the guard stations on the side of the palace, where it was dark. Kermit was relieved. If this coup had to succeed, total secrecy was necessary. Since the Shah most likely already knew why they were meeting, Kermit decided it was best to go right to the point. The reason for this was because Kermit had already communicated with Princess Ashraf, the Shah's twin sister, politically astute and ruthless enough for both of them. Princess Ashraf was everything the Shah was not. She viewed Mossaddegh as an adversary who had reduced the royal family's earnings by nationalizing Iranian oil. She was actually quite unpopular with the Iranian population, since she had been so outspoken about how much she disliked Mossaddegh. Moreover, a year ago, the Shah unofficially banished Princess Ashraf to Europe because of the outcry, which made him fearful for his own status. Kermit was aware that she would sympathize with Operation Ajax and that a bundle of cash and a brand new mink coat might be sufficient to persuade her to assist. That had been Kermit's fault. To Kermit's own amazement, however, the princess was unable to persuade her brother to fire Mossaddegh, despite her return to Iran and her pleas. Kermit had to turn to Plan B. The Shah owed a large sum of money to an army general, whom he summoned, and who had made some progress. Kermit realized it was up to him, however, because the Shah was still not quite persuaded to turn on his prime minister. He needed to speak with the Shah face to face about this. Kermit set up this meeting for midnight by using his connections. He was not going to waste it. He began his prepared statement by accusing Mossaddegh of being anti-royal. After all, that oil money dried up. The royal family's finances would eventually run dry, and perhaps they would be expelled from Iran entirely in a generation or two. Was that really Reza Shah's intention for his legacy? Kermit tried to make it sound informal and spontaneous. Even as he saw the Shah's face tighten, he pressed him. The Shah did not want to have this conversation, but it might have been what he was expecting. After just 5 minutes in the car, the Shah requested the driver to lead him back to the front steps, forcing Kermit to hide under his blanket once more out of fear of being noticed. Kermit could see, even from beneath the blanket, that the Shah hesitated for a second before getting out of the car, as if he had considered saying something, but decided against it. A grin appeared on Kermit's face as the car door slammed shut, and he felt a rush of adrenaline that kept him pacing his house for the remainder of the night. The Shah had paused. A tiny part of him had wanted to carry on the discussion. Kermit was certain. In order to arrange a second meeting with the Shah for that evening at the same time and location. Kermit called his contact the following morning, and they spoke repeatedly the following evening. On the evening of August 9th, the Shah descended the opulent front steps of the palace, while Kermit, as usual, waited beneath the blanket in the back seat. Kermit began his nightly tirade about the necessity of the Shah's backing as soon as he ducked inside the automobile. At this point, Kermit had the entire presentation committed to memory, and the more the Shah agreed with him, the more he pounded his argument. Mossadegh had to go because he was dangerous. The car was silent when Kermit finally caught his breath. Kermit knew the Shah was thinking about it, but his face was unreadable. The Shah gave in at last. He informed Kermit that he had gained a clearer perspective throughout the previous week. He was aware that the general, his own sister, and Kermit were most likely correct. Mossadegh would be removed from office by him. Kermit held his breath when the Shah agreed to sign the papers in the morning, but it took all of his strength not to holler aloud. After that, he instructed the driver to return him to the front steps. A rush of comfort swept over Kermit as he drew the blanket back over his head. A tiny part of him was shocked that he had actually done it. He had successfully finished all 3 stages of Operation Ajax in less than a month. School and Mossadegh would be removed from government in a few days, fulfilling his purpose. Kermit thanked the Shah and said he would be watching the television in the morning for the announcement as the car came to a stop outside the palace steps. The Shah, however, indicated that it would have to wait till Saturday and clicked his tongue. Thursday and Friday were Iranian weekends, and nobody was going to topple the regime on their day off. On Saturday, August 15th, 1953, Colonel Nima Neri was sitting in the lead car of a military caravan just before midnight. He was in charge of the Imperial Guard and was on a secret mission with a small group of military officers under cover of darkness. That evening, a number of military caravans were slicing through Tehran streets on their way to Iranian politicians' residences. The colonel was aware that Kermit, Roosevelt, and other operatives had assembled at a safe house across town, anticipating a call regarding the success or failure of tonight's operation. The colonel had heard that the agents were enjoying vodka and the song "Luck Be a Lady" from the American musical Guys and Dolls while seated around a record player. They could use all the luck they could get, the colonel thought with a smile. The colonel reached into his breast pocket again and felt for the folded piece of paper he had kept there for protection. Mossadegh was removed from office by an official proclamation that was signed by the Shah himself. He would personally present the edict to Mossadegh within an hour, and if the Prime Minister objected, he would have him arrested at his door. They had to stop first, though. In a posh area of Tehran, Colonel Neri's vehicle parked in front of a beautiful residence. Neri and 2 officers leaped off the vehicle. Neri wanted to accomplish this face-to-face out of respect. Even though he knew the police could have completed this portion of the task alone. Rapped on the door and waited for the military chief of staff of Mossadegh to respond. The man would undoubtedly be home by now, most likely already sound sleeping, given it was late. Before telling the military chief of staff that he was being detained, Neri would wait for him to roll out of bed and approach the door. It made little difference that the charges would be untrue. All he needed to do was hold the chief of staff for a few hours. The CIA operatives across town had sought to ensure that when they dismissed Mossadegh, it would be no one accessible for him to call, no prospect of organizing support or starting a fight, because Neri would proceed to Mossadegh's residence after arresting the chief of staff. Mossadegh would find himself surrounded and alone. Minutes passed, but no one answered the door. Neri knocked again, more forcefully. They waited, but the house's lights did not come on. There was no movement, no sign that anyone was even awake, so Neri put his palms to the glass to look into the dim foyer. 5 minutes later, Neri and his officers discovered the residence was deserted. There was no sign of the military chief of staff or his family. Strange, but Neri convinced himself that they might have made a last-minute excursion out of town to visit relatives, or they might have been out late at a friend's house and lost track of time. Neri chose not to investigate. They would proceed to Mossadegh's residence. After 20 minutes, Neri and his convoy arrived at the Mossadegh family apartment complex's main gate. The apartment complex had been owned for years by the Prime Minister's family. Even after being elected Prime Minister, Mossadegh and his wife had remained in one of the corner apartments rather than purchasing a fancy home. The colonel got out of the lead car and went to the security officer on duty at the gate as the caravan came to a stop. Behind him, he heard automobile doors open, and he realized that a crowd of military officers was already forming a queue. As the officers formed up, he observed the security guard's face and read the fear in his eyes. And that was good, Neri thought. Neri would rather there be no violence tonight, and a fearful guard was far more likely to comply. After wishing the guard a pleasant evening, he gave him the signed papers that officially removed Mossadegh from his position. He insisted on being admitted to the complex. Despite not opening the gate, the guard gave a nod. Then a number of individuals dressed in military garb emerged from the darkness and encircled Neri and his officers. One of them commanded Neri's officers to disarm. They were armed, as 2 of the military personnel took him by the upper arm and led him to a jeep sitting just outside the gate. Neri attempted to hide his surprise. The colonel was now headed to jail, and it was obvious that their scheme had failed. Early on August 16th, Kermit roamed the American Embassy's compound's hallways, alternating between the need to drown his sorrows in vodka and the urge to punch a wall. He had just been compelled to write to Washington to explain the failure of Operation Ajax. Kermit had chosen vodka the previous evening. After pouring himself a drink, he settled into his office armchair and switched on the radio. The sky was turning rosy pink outside his office window. Across the street, the sun was slowly rising over the rooftops. Kermit felt vulnerable, as if his shortcomings were going to be brought into the harsh light of day. A newscaster declared on the radio that a coup attempt against Prime Minister Mossadegh had failed overnight. As the reporter described Neri's detention outside Mossadegh's house, Kermit wanted to hurl his glass across the room. Then one of the other agents walked into Kermit's office and knocked on his door. The agent claimed to have the specifics of what had happened the previous evening while perched on the edge of Kermit's desk. Mossadegh acted immediately after somehow learning that he was going to be fired. After forcing his supporters to flee their residences in order to escape being arrested, he stationed soldiers outside of them to watch for Neri and his accomplices to strike. They would then be caught in the act of ambush and taken into custody for treason. The Shah had already gone to Rome with his wife because he was so scared. When his plane landed in Italy, he apparently encountered several reporters and joked that he might be searching for work soon as he strolled onto the tarmac. Kermit let out a loud grunt at that, as he was astounded by this Shah's apparent lack of courage. After agreeing, the agent moved away from Kermit's desk and made his way to the wet bar. He poured some of Kermit's vodka for himself. There was more, he informed Kermit. A cable had been dispatched this morning from CIA headquarters. They were ending their relationship. They told Kermit to give up and take the first flight back to Washington. Kermit experienced shell shock. It felt like a sucker punch to the belly to consider giving up on his mission and failing where his grandfather had succeeded. He was unable to breathe. He simply gulped down the remaining vodka and instructed the agent to let him stew on his own. He was baffled by how this had occurred. Sure, it was a dangerous strategy, but it was feasible. He had carefully prepared the foundation. However, the Shah was no longer in power, and Mossadegh remained in charge. He reclined in his seat and gazed up at the ceiling, alternating between incredulity and rage. He kept staring at the tiny cracks that ran across the plaster of the ceiling, mentally reviewing the plan over and over again, looking for any weak spots, attempting to determine who might have snitched. This was not how it had to end. He came dangerously close to doing it. Wheels whirling, he poured himself another vodka. He saw that he still had relationships and resources, like he had been doing since he entered Tehran a month ago. He could still find a way to remove Mossadegh from government. Find a way to turn this failed coup around and alter the course of events. He instructed Washington to cancel his flight home via a wire transfer that morning. He was staying. By that afternoon, he had a clear idea of how to restart Operation Ajax. By early August 16th afternoon, Kermit had purchased a brand new state-of-the-art piece of equipment, a photocopier. In all of Tehran, it was among the few copy machines. It resembled two refrigerators tied together in size. The copy machine roared to life as Kermit turned it on, making a noise akin to someone pounding a hammer inside. He ordered as many copies as the copier could produce after feeding a piece of paper into it. As it produced hundreds of photocopies, it trembled. Down the corridor, agents could hear the machine. Kermit seemed to have set up a bowling alley in the break room. In a matter of hours, however, he had a pile of flyers photocopies of the decree that the Shah had signed, which had expelled Mossadegh from power. He gave his officers orders to start posting them throughout the city, but particularly in the more impoverished areas on the south side of Tehran. He then forwarded a few copies to his newspaper editors and reporters. He wanted his version of events and the edict written on the top page of every newspaper. The current news reports were completely inaccurate. Mossadegh was actually attempting to depose the Shah in the coup. Kir returned to his office and called to Iranians he had been collaborating with since coming to Tehran. Once he was confident the documents would support his account, he needed a significant favor. It was a risk, but nothing the two of them could not manage. The men were hesitant to participate. Although Kermit's request was within their purview, it was far more ambitious than anything they had previously tried. Kermit questioned the Iranians on whether $50,000 would be sufficient to persuade them to take part. Then, during the lengthy beat of silence, he held his breath. On the other end of the phone, he could hear muffled whispers. Kermit changed his offer because he did not have time to negotiate. Kermit would have the men killed if they did not accept the $50,000 and carry out the plan. Kermit was cruel in addition to being intelligent. One of the groups from the south side of Tehran took to the streets the following morning, August 17th, with signs demanding that the Shah remain in Rome, despite their less than courteous wording. The signs made their point. They screamed together and yelled Antisha slogans, and soon another street gang joined them. By midday, their numbers had significantly increased, and all of their members were gang members and criminals. The street was clogged with demonstrators, forcing onlookers to hide in alleys in order to pass. Mossadegh supporters joined their march as their anti-Shah rhetoric intensified, excited to be a part of a demonstration in defense of their beloved prime leader. Tens of thousands of Iranians had gathered by the time they arrived in Parliament Square, yelling their support for Mossadegh and denouncing the Shah, who had fled his own nation. In the center of the square, a huge statue of the Shah on a horse was climbed by a number of guys. They tugged a cord that they had slung around the marble Shah's neck. The entire statue fell quickly, and stunned news reporters broadcast a play-by-play over the radio as it crashed onto the cobblestone below. Sitting in his office with a number of other CIA personnel who had participated in Operation Ajax, Kermit Roosevelt listened to the entire broadcast. The entire room cheered as the reporter announced that the statue had been toppled. Kermit was overjoyed. He paid the street gang leaders he had bribed the previous evening to instigate this protest. The order had been straightforward: lead the charge and overthrow the statue of Shah in Parliament Square. It seemed to Kermit that Operation Ajax was back on course. However, the entire purpose of the trip was to help the Shah and turn the Iranians against the Prime Minister. In what way, then, was this advantageous? To put it plainly, you cannot genuinely undermine a nation without provoking conflict. When protests resumed the following morning, Kermit paid the gang members to go out into the streets and chant slogans like "I love Mossadegh" and "I love communism." "I want a people's republic," while they broke windows, shot into mosques, looted shops, and beat any unlucky bystanders who happened to cross their path. They sparked a full-scale riot. The riots had gotten so terrible by Tuesday morning, August 18th, that Mossadegh was compelled to publicly ban his followers from protesting and make an appearance on national television. However, when the sun rose over Tehran on the 19th, spectators saw the strangest crowd yet. Weightlifters carrying barbells above their heads, possibly as a display of their physical prowess, marched down the street while shouting Prussia slogans like "Long live the Shah." Most of them were dressed only in loincloths and curled mustaches. Behind them were musclemen with blades and jugglers tossing heavy pins. Although it was not his best work, Kermit had to acknowledge that it would do, because shortly after, military officials and police joined the circus artists in singing Prussia slogans, urging him to return from Rome. More than just a chaotic display, it was seen by onlookers as a show of solidarity, as organizations from all walks of life in Tehran united to support the Shah. Whatever humor the mob could have instilled soon vanished. As they approached Mossadegh's apartment, they grew in size and speed, torched 3 pro-Mossadegh newspaper offices and 8 government buildings on fire en route. From his command center, Kermit could see the smoke, and the sight warmed his heart more than the days of alcohol he had been consuming. The Prussia demonstrators then began fighting with the Mossadegh supporters and innocent bystanders after the Mossadegh supporters emerged to confront the crowd. For long, gunfire rang out and fists flew. 300 Tyrannists had been killed by the time the Shah supporters' horde arrived at Mossadegh's home. As the crowd stormed into the property where Mossadegh and his family resided and started looting, Kermit listened to the radio broadcasts back in his office. Some of them went upstairs to Mossadegh's bedroom, where they had heard the Prime Minister was awaiting arrest, or worse, while others destroyed his furniture and seized his family's antiques. Until the wood broke and the hinges came away, the most hungry mobsters flung themselves against his bedroom door. However, his bedroom was deserted when they walked in. The Prime Minister appeared to have run away. Instead of attempting to locate Mossadegh, the gang proceeded with their raid, removing all of the valuable equipment and furnishings and loading them into trucks outside. They announced Mossadegh's official overthrow to eager news reporters. Kermit was eating lunch and listening to the radio back at the command center. Kermit was paying attention as if it were the 9th inning of the World Series. Even though the announcer was halfway through a broadcast about the current price of grain. Dead air enveloped the room as the announcer's voice slowed and eventually stopped altogether. In anticipation, Kermit grinned to himself. He waited anxiously, leaning back in his chair. It was a few minutes later when Kermit heard 2 men bickering over the radio. Leaning closer, he tried to hear what they were saying, but it was too muffled. With growing anticipation, he tapped his toes. Following yet another pause, a new commentator announced on the radio, "The government of Mossadegh has been defeated." Kermit poured more vodka for himself. For better or worse, Kermit had finally become the man he had always desired after the coup had succeeded. A few days later, Kermit Roosevelt was waiting for Reza Shah as he strolled down his palace's main staircase and into his opulent sitting room. It was shortly after midnight. Kermit had not been lurking under a blanket in the driveway tonight, but the Shah felt it was proper to stick to their regular meeting time. He had walked in right in front of the guards. Kermit sat down when the Shah indicated a chair. A servant brought a tray of vodka, and each guy drank a glass while the Shah sat opposite him. Kermit was informed that the toast was in his honor by the Shah, who lifted his own. He owed Kermit Roosevelt his people tonight, but God his throne. Grinning, Kermit sipped his beverage. The Shah did the same. The vodka tasted particularly smooth tonight. Now, fast forward to November 4th, 1979, which is 26 years later. A young CIA officer observed Iranian students shouting anti-American slogans outside the American embassy in Tehran. Abruptly, buses brimming with more boisterous protesters raced in the direction of the embassy. Students rushed out the doors to join their fellow protesters. As soon as the buses skidded to a stop, other students applauded. The operator saw a female student atop the embassy gate using bolt cutters. Concerned that the situation was getting worse, the agent called his superiors in Washington, D.C. The embassy was abruptly overrun by armed students as the doors flew open. The operative was taken captive, along with 89 other Americans in the embassy, before he realized it. The hostage situation in Iran lasted for 444 days. Operation Ajax is the reason why these teenagers captured America's interest for over a year and a half, and may have cost President Jimmy Carter a second term. The Shah installed a new administration following Kermit's coup. Qaeda military police eventually located and detained Mossad. Qaeda, he was placed under house imprisonment at his family's isolated estate in the Iranian countryside for 3 years of solitary confinement by the United States. However, the cost of Mossad's supporters' devotion to the Prime Minister and their nation was higher. Because they helped save Mossad's life and tried to thwart the coup, a number of allies received death sentences. Its final democratically elected leader in Iranian history was Mossadegh. Reza Shah was given more authority by the new Prime Minister, enabling him to govern as a more conventional monarch. But he mostly depended on the U.S. and military to keep that authority. People who have since left Iran used to joke that as long as you did not ask questions, life was good. That is not exactly a democratic tenet. Iranians hated the Iranian government so much during the next 25 years that it ruined Iran's ties with the United States and prepared the ground for the 1979 Iranian hostage crisis, in which young revolutionaries took control of the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. Ayatollah Khomeini was installed as supreme leader following a revolution. Khomeini used the Shah's methods of using force to impose a crushing dictatorship despite his promises of freedom. Since then, Iranians have been struggling for democracy, frequently at the expense of their lives. For the CIA, Operation Ajax was a huge success and a significant turning point for their recently formed agency. It served as a model for subsequent CIA-planned takeovers worldwide. However, in the long run, Operation Ajax prepared the ground for Iran to emerge as one of the most despised adversaries of the United States. Kermit could have become the man he had always desired as a result of Operation Ajax, but he ought to have been cautious about what he wished for. Kermit is recognized for the long-lasting suffering caused by Operation Ajax, but his grandpa, President Theodore Roosevelt, is remembered for becoming the first American to earn the Nobel Peace Prize for bringing a stop to the Russo-Japanese War. Regretfully for the Roosevelt family, his legacy has contributed to Middle East instability and instilled a deep anti-American sentiment in many Iranians for centuries.